Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you here in London and to our very large online audience. I'm Sara Pantuliano. I'm the Chief Executive here at ODI Global, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this In Conversation event, and really delighted to introduce Antonio Patriota, the Ambassador of Brazil to the United Kingdom, and I think one of the most distinguished diplomats of our time, really. And you'll see why. I mean, you don't need to take my word for it. We'll see through this conversation. But before his current role, Ambassador Patriota served as Brazil's foreign minister from 2011 to 2013, and his diplomatic career involves key roles as ambassador to Egypt, to Italy, my country of birth, the United States, as well as Brazil's permanent representative to the United Nations from 2013 to 2016, where he also served as the chair of the Peacebuilding Commission. It's a shared passion of ours. But Ambassador Patriota also served in Geneva, New York, in Beijing, in Caracas. It really has shaped Brazil's foreign policy across the globe, and is a member of the Leaders for Peace initiative under the chairmanship of former French Prime Minister Raphael. And I'm really pleased to have Ambassador Patriota following the release of his book, A Humanist Foreign Policy for a Multipolar World. I think the title immediately attracted my attention and felt that I really wanted to deepen this conversation. And it's a fascinating collection of articles that encapsulates his diplomatic philosophy that has been shaped by decades in global affairs. And in the book, Ambassador Patriota really brings a unique perspective on the urgent need for a cooperative, values-driven approach to global affairs. You reimagine global governance in a very timely way as the world faces intensifying crisis. We've got 100 armed conflict at the moment, more and more serious climate events, widening inequality, and multilateral institutions under growing strain. So your call is both clear and compelling. So today we'll explore Ambassador Patriota's vision for a new multilateralism and the humanist foreign policy, and examine how emerging powers like Brazil can help advance a cooperative global order, including through platforms such as the BRICS and Finance South-South cooperation. But let's get started. We'll have a half-an-hour conversation where I'll ask Ambassador Patriota a few questions on a few of the themes that are discussed in the book, and then I'll come to all of you, both in the room and online, for your questions. And then for those of you who are in London, you can also join us for a small reception to continue the conversation online, informally next door. But without further ado, let's get started. Ambassador Patriota, in 2023, over 60% of the new global growth came from emerging markets, but their representation in global decision-making remains very limited. So how can emerging and mid-sized powers, actually, you call them regional powers of global influence on my podcast just a few weeks ago, how can they contribute to a cooperative rather than competitive multipolar world order?
Well, let me start by saying how pleased I am to be here with you, Sara. I think since we met last year, we bonded over several interest areas, including Peacebuilding Commission. You are with a Peacebuilding Fund. And since then, I've come to appreciate and respect very much the work carried out by ODI. So it's truly a pleasure to be here to have a conversation around some of the ideas in the book. This book really covers articles that I wrote over the past 10 years, more or less, since I ceased being foreign minister. If anybody is interested in the period when I was foreign minister, there are 2 volumes of all the speeches and articles that I wrote at that time. But I thought that some of these articles that are lengthier than usual might have an interest, and also they are in English. There's quite a bit of material on Brazilian foreign policy in Portuguese to Brazilian audiences. But I felt like, the Brazilian specificity is often misunderstood, or we are lumped in with other groups of countries, and, our unique profile doesn't have an opportunity to appear. So I felt it was important to have a collection in English. Most of the articles had been written in English. The ones that were not, I had translated. And there are three texts that reflect my work with the Leaders for Peace group. This is not a very well-known group, but maybe I'll just explain briefly that former French Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin brought together about 40 individuals from all over the world, former foreign ministers, former prime ministers, some from academia, etc. And this group has existed since 2018. And I became the rapporteur, meaning that each year I propose a kind of collective communiqué for the group to issue. And we annually hand it over to the UN Secretary General. So that was an interesting new exercise for me because I'm used to writing, let's say, either in an individual capacity or as a Brazilian diplomat, but I was not really used to trying to reflect a more collective view of world affairs that would include the perspective from Europe, Africa, China, Iran, etc. I mean, there are representatives from all these countries. And it was a very gratifying experience to come to the conclusion that it's not that difficult really to rally around certain core ideas and beliefs and aspirations for the international community. So to try to answer your question a little bit, it's true that sometimes I react in a slightly critical manner to categorizations that were not produced by my country or by someone with my world perspective. So I don't really like this idea of mid-size power, middle power, because I usually distinguish between three areas of influence or power. One is military. So in military terms, you really have three major powers, the West or NATO, now in a kind of global northern crisis that we are observing. So that may be splitting into two, then China and Russia. There are no mid-size military powers that have global influence. But on the economic front, you could argue that the G20 members are all significant powers to some degree, whether they are established powers or more emerging. And I have no difficulty in acknowledging that Brazil is only really exercising global influence since about 20, 30 years. I would say since the 21st century, probably, because this is when we really expanded our network of embassies to cover the entire world. And we have companies and businesses that are playing a role internationally and globally, et cetera. I think we could say the same thing about India, more or less, although Brazil has been independent for 200 years, but only coming to the world stage really in economic terms, 21st century. And then I think we should also look at diplomatic influence, because you don't really have to be either military or an economic power to exercise global diplomatic influence. You can be a comparatively small country like Norway, for example, that is very active in promoting peace negotiations, or through their wealth fund. They can also enact, and even through granting the Nobel Peace Prize, they have a certain leverage internationally. I have here the representative of the Red Cross. Switzerland is in a similar category. So not a member of G20, not a military power, and yet a significant diplomatic power. Having made these distinctions, I believe that since we are in an environment where nuclear weapons play a deterring role for world conflict, and it was only 2 years ago, I believe, or was it 3? 2, that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council recognized that there is no winner in a nuclear war. So, this is very much the environment in which we function militarily. This only enhances the importance of economic and diplomatic influence. So whereas Brazil does not aspire to be a military power, we have no enemies, we have a relatively stable environment in South America. our constitution prevents us from becoming members of military alliances. What I think is possible to say about Brazil is that we have economic influence. We're among the 10 largest in the world. Last year, we hosted the G20. And we are also a diplomatic country of a certain influence, because if you look at the Lowy Institute's statistics of the countries with the greatest number of embassies around the world, we're number 10. So again, in a similar situation as with regard to economic power. In addition to that, very strong engagement with the multilateral system. We were a founding member of the United Nations. We have shaped policy in the UN and in the WTO. And I think it's fair to say that we've accumulated a certain amount of experience. For example, not everyone is aware of the fact that among the developing countries of the world, or the global South countries, if you wish to use that expression, we have been the most frequently elected to the United Nations Security Council, 11 times. So, you know, all this accumulation of, let's say, know-how and a certain economic, diplomatic, political weight should be placed at the service of a cause. And I think in the case of Brazil, it is very much invested in trying to create a cooperative international environment without prescribing solutions or telling others how to behave, but certainly looking at to what extent countries are observing or not international law and avenues for cooperation. I think what's very discouraging about the current moment we are living is the ease with which very significant players resort to unilateral behavior. So disregard for international law, disregard for the disciplines regulating trade and economic cooperation, denial of science when it comes to the environment or to pandemics and others. And this is where humanism comes in, because you know, I was ambassador in Italy, and I drew a lot of inspiration from the Umanesimo, the sources of the Enlightenment, and what many would consider the pillars of Western civilization. This is a belief in rationality and looking at science, education, wisdom also derived from spiritual traditions, but staying away from dogma and ideological barriers. And also a very strong belief, which is a characteristic of the current Brazilian government, something President Lula often says, in political engagement, diplomatic engagement. So you put all these together, this is Brazil today.
Let's explore some of these practical applications of this diplomatic power. I mean, Brazil has been really active in regional sort of multilateral forums. So what lessons can we draw from Brazil's role in fostering dialogue, in South-South cooperation, in facilitating crisis mediation through its role with the BRICS or IBSA, the India-Brazil-South Africa dialogue, or the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, particularly when traditional institutions, as you're saying, are faltering?
Yeah, no, I often try to say things that are slightly innovative and not to repeat what you read elsewhere. As much as I believe that regional integration is important, and we've been very active with the Mercosur free trade area, there are many countries that are associated to Mercosur. So on the economic and trade front, South America is relatively integrated. It's been more challenging to integrate in terms of foreign policy, in terms of world outlook, because as the Munich Security Conference has identified, and for those who haven't read their report for this year, I really recommend it. It's a very good report. It's called multipolarization. And that's a really smart word, because it encapsulates the notion that we are transitioning towards multipolarity. But in that transition, there's a lot of polarization as well, within countries and among countries in the international community. So this is also perceptible in Latin America. And the polarization between different ideologies, or sometimes very extremist political views, makes it difficult to integrate regionally. But this is where I'll come in with maybe a slightly different idea, which is in a kind of globalized world, it's true that globalization is suffering setbacks right now, but we are globalized in terms of communication, possibility for travel, the internet, etc. It's much easier to coordinate with countries that are not part of your region than it ever has been historically. So this is where I think Brazilian diplomacy is taking advantage of these new opportunities through groups like IBSA, which brings together three important democracies from the global south, Brazil, India, South Africa, or even the BRICS, which is a more economic attuned group, now with several countries from the Middle East, Asia, Africa. Brazil and Argentina used to be a member, was invited for a while, but now has withdrawn, possibly Colombia joining. And not in the recent, even in the recent past, this was not so common and as possible as it is today. So I think this characteristic of contemporary international relations opens the gateway for very interesting partnerships across continents and across cultural traditions. You know, who would have thought Brazil and China would have such a strong relationship as we do today, with China being by far a #1 trading partner, for example.
Let's turn to your book. You call in the book for a new humanism, for a renewed multilateralism, and you really highlight the global crisis that we face, from Ukraine to climate change, cannot be resolved through power politics, or definitely not through power politics alone. And you contend that multilateralism, despite all its imperfections, is still the most inclusive and fair platform for collective action. So I want to tease out, what a humanist foreign policy looks like in practice. How does it differ from traditional approaches that prioritize power, prioritize, national self-interest? And the key question I have is how a foreign policy that is based on values like peace, like solidarity, human rights, realistically aligns with a country's strategic goals. And where have you seen that work in practice?
Yes, so I think what you may derive from reading some of the articles is the idea that humanism is not only an idealistic posture, let's say, that is based on values such as human dignity and attention to the needs of the most vulnerable within a society, trying to improve governance at the local and international level, or in the age of climate change, being environmentally responsible. All of this would qualify as humanism, but I think it's also practical and smart, because the alternatives did not demonstrate their usefulness. In fact, engaging in arms races and investing in power games through the use of force, through military intervention, has more often than not, and I think the examples in the recent past are very eloquent, produced the opposite of the intended results. If you look at intervention in Iraq, what has it done? Has it installed democracy in Iraq and stabilized the region? No. It introduced terrorism and disruption in a country where it was not present. It actually made Iran the strongest for a long time. I think Iran right now is in a weaker position, but right after, in the aftermath of the intervention, Iran was one of the biggest beneficiaries, and this was not the objective of the intervention in Iraq. So the same thing can be said about Libya. It was supposed to stabilize it, destabilize the entire Sahel, and so on and so forth. So this idea that investing in the use of force and military power is going to bring you benefits, I think, is a very big illusion. It does bring benefits to some big weapons producers and to some industrial interests, but I don't think it's beneficial to society as a whole. So this is where humanism is not only idealistic. I think it's also the right answer for those who want to see civilization advance. And again, this draws inspiration from Italian umanesimo. It did advance civilization in the Renaissance, and it flourished into the Enlightenment and to the more sophisticated political forms of organization that we witnessed after Montesquieu and all, the other thinkers of this 17th century, 18th century, and so on which we base our institutions today.
Actually, building on what you say, even if you look at crises where we haven't had an intervention like Iraq or Libya, but look at Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, these crises actually expose the consequences of sidelining humanist values, peace, self-determination, human rights in favor of power politics. These are foundational principles of the United Nations charters. Now, when foreign policy departs from these principles, what is the impact on the global order? Because I think it goes beyond, the country in question. It impacts our ability, as a collective to maintain this principle framework.
Yeah, I think one point that is worth making is that unilateralism, whether it is on the economic and trade front or in the military arena, right, interventions in violation of international law, are not a new feature of the international landscape. They've been with us, they've existed for several decades. Again, I don't think that they've demonstrated their usefulness in any scenario, even when they had a legal standing like the intervention in Afghanistan. What happened after 17 years? Those who intervened leave and the Taliban comes back with a vengeance. So it seems to me that there's a little bit of a march of folly going on here. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Barbara Tuchman book that she wrote after the Vietnam War, in which she analyzes why is it that so many rulers or political figures adopt policies that are ultimately in contradiction with their own objectives and do not strengthen them, in the end up weakening their international status. It's a bit of a folly. So one of the articles in the book is entitled "The March of Reason," because I think it precisely tries to depart from this kind of pattern of behavior of the past. But going back to the idea that unilateralism is not necessarily new, it is in itself disruptive. It is the enemy of international cooperation. There's no doubt about that. But there's one thing I would say about, let's say, the current pattern of the United States foreign policy. And I have to maybe qualify that I'm speaking very freely here. So in theory, something close to Chatham House rules, although I know that I probably will be quoted.
You're online.
Yeah, I'm online.
You're being streamed.
But let's say a country
with a very large audience.
Right, a country that says, well, I'm interested in a big island near the Arctic Circle, so, I may take it over under my sovereignty. Or I want to rebaptize a certain gulf, or there's a canal that is of interest to me and I will take over. And there's a large country on my northern border. Why not transform that into my state? So all these attitudes are extremely inimical to international cooperation, I would say. They're unilateral attitudes. But the other point that I would make is that if this kind of behavior had happened during the so-called unipolar moment, when you had a configuration of power where military, economic, and diplomatic power was concentrated in the hands of one unique country, this would have had a very damaging consequence for the international system. What I think is happening today is that the United States, through these and other policies, including the tariffs, et cetera, is accelerating the transition to multipolarity in different ways, including in the following way. It's difficult to argue today that Europe converges with the US policy on trade or on security or on sustaining democracy, for example, right? So there seems that where there used to be one unique Western pole, now perhaps there are two. And there's an interesting phenomenon also, which is the electoral outcome in Canada and Australia. So what we see is, the political repercussions of this very unilateralist attitude is not gaining supporters internationally necessarily. And that is actually positive for multilateralism, because not only does one identify a group of countries within the more developed North that seem to be very attached to rule of law and to international law, but you also have many countries in the South, such as my own, that have as a principal foreign policy the objective of sustaining and, where necessary, adapting or improving international law. So there's no reason to despair, in my opinion.
No, on the contrary, I think what we're seeing is that countries like Brazil is exercising very positive influence internationally in terms of this more, inclusive and cooperative multilateralism. And, but as you say yourself, you are the 10th economic power, so-called. You are a founding member of the BRICS. You've been leading a number of diplomatic initiatives or sort of played a role globally, from having sort of just chaired the G20. Now you'll host the COP this year. Brazil is definitely playing a very prominent global role. But if we look at the multilateral structures as they are, Brazil, like many other countries, the reasoning, influence, and stature are not represented, starting with the UN Security Council. How do we change that?
Yes, well, the fact that there is strong support for preserving multilateralism does not mean that we need to preserve it as it stands. I think it's demonstrating inadequacies in many areas. And there's actually an international consensus to this effect, because as you will remember, last year, UN Secretary General convened a Summit of the Future. So this was supported by all UN member states. And there was an outcome document. It was difficult to negotiate an outcome document, but nevertheless, with some reservations here and there, it was adopted. And it calls for accelerated reform of the Security Council, for strengthening of General Assembly, for a more inclusive secretariat, et cetera. So the movement towards, let's say, more democratic, more inclusive, but also better adapted to 21st century challenges, multilateralism is certainly there at the governmental level. But I would also argue that at the civil society, non-governmental level, there is even higher degree of ambition. So I recently came across and am now engaged with a group called the Coalition for UN Charter Review. You probably know them, Heba Ali and others.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Supporting them, hosting them.
They're fantastic people, and they are really networking all over the world. They're calling for something that Brazil supports, which is a review conference of the UN Charter, not to open up the entire UN Charter, but to introduce, for example, the notion of collective responsibility towards the planet, which was not there in 1945. It was not even an issue. I mean, global warming was not in anybody's agenda. And then to respond to the outcome document of the Summit of the Future and look at those areas where manifestly you need to adjust to the contemporary geopolitical distribution of power. But one of the points that I make in one of the articles, so this is kind of to encourage you to take a look, not at all of them, but maybe one or two, is that multipolarity is not inherently unstable. It's curious that, I've been to a few international events like the Raisina Dialogue in India and others, where I come across people who try to argue that multipolarity is going to make the world more unstable. And there's no, if you look at the literature of international relations, there is no demonstration of this. In fact, it could work very well. If you look at the Congress of Vienna and the European system after the Napoleonic Wars, it was a kind of multipolarity of sorts, for that world, which did not include the global South. And it worked for a number of decades. You could argue that it did not survive because it did not adjust to changes in the system, which is something we're trying to do now. But we're also arguing that we shouldn't wait for another world war or for something of that nature, that dimension, to start reforming, because unless there is a strong movement towards reform, and it's true that Brazil is among the leaders, the front runners in this regard, we run the risk of reaching a tipping point. So this is another point that I make in one of the articles. Not only do we have a climate or environmental tipping point beyond which life on the planet will become impossible, but there may be a systemic tipping point where you just observe paralysis in the Security Council, inability to handle, things like Gaza, Ukraine, etc., with no attempt to reform and to change the methodology for dealing with these issues. And that I think would be very serious setback for civilization.
I couldn't agree more. We know very well that people, institutions have power very rarely cede it. So it's always a matter of trying to claw back some of this power. And I think we've seen a lot of reforms so far have been very technocratic in nature. That's why I don't think they've the impacts we really need. But I really hope that the coalition can get the political buy-in and support. And that's why Brazil's engagement is so important.
Well, they are visiting Brazil next month, the coalition. And I think the idea behind this visit is to show the Brazilian government that they may be a little bit isolated governmentally speaking. Not too many countries want to go that far. But when it comes to civil society, they have a lot of support internationally, including from ODI. Now I just found out.
For sure, absolutely. Great. Well, let me open this to the audience. There is a roving mic somewhere. When I give you the floor, please say who you are, if you are affiliated to any institution, organizations. I'll also take questions online. So if you are online, you can add your question to the online chat that you see at the bottom of the screen. Gentlemen here, please. I'll take a couple, come back to you, then do another round. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Tom Fabozzi from the Irish Embassy. Ambassador, how much of a threat do you think misinformation is to the cause of multilateralism? Because, for instance, you and I might call ourselves multilateralists, and someone with a contrary viewpoint may refer to us as globalists in a negative sense.
Thank you very much. Someone else? Okay, since you close, I'll come here and then.
Can I borrow your pen?
Oh, yes.
Thank you. My name is Rodrigo Sarrayonga from Access Partnership. Ambassador, thank you for the conversation. My question, you referenced the Summit of the Future last year, and this was like a big event happening where countries adopted a global digital compact, talking about multilateralism and digital cooperation, and how countries can move forward in advancing these governance frameworks. How do you see Brazil's role in the future of this multipolar world? Maybe we can call it a multipolar tech world, and what Brazil's vision should be, and especially considering how emerging technologies will be shaping a lot of the international cooperation and discussions moving forward.
Thanks. And yes, he's over there. I'll come back to you and do another round.
My name is Łukasz Gałka. I'm from the University of London. So, Mr. Patriota, I read, I would say, your files. So, from my knowledge, you have been the ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2009, so throughout the financial crisis. So, my question would be, how different was that period for you as a diplomat? Do you feel that this event had brought the world maybe together in that it was a crisis and everyone was kind of eager to cooperate and find a solution that would work for every country? So maybe there are things that we could take for to take conclusions from how it worked back then, and whether can we apply anything from that period for the future. Thank you.
Okay, can I take those three?
Yeah.
The first two questions are actually interrelated, and I think you're absolutely correct. Disinformation is one of the big challenges of today. I would actually go back to humanism of the Renaissance times, because even then there was a concern with the accuracy of information, maybe from a different perspective. There was a sense that religious dogma was conveying certain myths about the past that did not stand up to close scrutiny. So the humanists were very good at doing this without attempting or without seeming to be anti-clerical or against the Pope or anything like that, but engaging in historic studies in a way that would clarify certain aspects of, human historical development. I think today we're confronted with very much a similar problem, but on a huge, much bigger scale, which are inaccurate and very often dishonestly inaccurate versions of reality and what is going on. Also, omission or censorship. For example, the way some countries are failing to report on the genocide in Gaza, is very much along these lines. I know you're from Ireland. Ireland is not among those countries. On the contrary, you recognize the state of Palestine. So this is a common challenge for all of us. And if you actually declare yourself a democracy and committed to democracy, I think you must be engaged in this struggle to ensure that the political debate is based on facts and not on constructed ideas. Or there was this lady in the United States who spoke of alternative facts, remember? Yeah. So a lot of this is happening before our very eyes, and we have to resist. How do you resist? I think one of the ways is actually the second question, is disciplining and establishing guardrails for information technology, for artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is very much based on data that is collected through certain sources that privilege some parts of the world, some worldviews, some orientations. And so they have a bias themselves. And how do you escape from these traps? I think a very high-level debate, which includes the scientists, but also diplomats and others who are concerned with the ethics behind all of this, has to take place. I personally I'm not a practicing Catholic, but a great admirer of Pope Francis. And one very inspiring text that I read last year, in fact, it may have been this year, was his January 1st message of peace, where he defends the notion of a sense of limit. It's a very interesting text and very well argued. I would recommend it anyone who's interested in the ethics behind information technology, because he says that the absence of a sense of limit could lead humanity really into very dangerous territory. So it's not being anti-science or against progress. It's just kind of warning that there are avenues which may seem to be leading towards greater progress, efficiency, et cetera, but they're actually leading towards a kind of a tragic or destructive path. We need a conversation about these, and I think the ideal place to have it is the United Nations, so that it can be inclusive and it can be, let's say, oriented through specialists. But I think we also need the science participating and providing the input that will ensure that you're not talking in the abstract and a way that is devoid from reality. On the comparison between the period I was ambassador to the US and today, I think anybody would agree that those were very different times. I was in Washington when Barack Obama was elected president. In fact, I think one of the big challenges for an ambassador to the United States or to any bilateral post for an ambassador is to try to inform his government, his or her government, what he believes will be the outcome of an election, right? Before the election. So whether the polls are actually to be trusted or not. And I took a risk at the time. I thought Obama would be elected. And many people in my country said, oh, Americans will never put a black man in the White House. And I thought, no, I think the Americans will. In fact, they did that before my own country did so. And I hope very soon we do that as well. But one of the features of the Barack Obama persona politically that I thought was very welcome at the time is the fact that he had been against the Iraq War. So it seemed like he would be a multilateralist, that he would not encourage similar adventures in the future. And yet I have to say that I was a little bit disappointed, because there were situations where he did not stand up to the promise of abiding by international law in Libya and other places, even in the, let's say, almost blind eye towards, Israeli settlements in occupied territory, except for one famous vote in the Security Council where Samantha Power allowed a resolution to go ahead and to criticize a settlement. So what that leads me to say is that whereas those were very different times, and also the style of government, the adherence to science, to culture, the openness to other ideas was encouraging, let's put it that way. I also believe that there's a very strong unilateralist streak, exceptionalist streak in the United States that has been present throughout most of its recent history. And what you see are different manifestations sometimes, manifestations that are less welcome around the world than others, but essentially, US diplomacy has pretty much adopted the view that it will go along with a multilateral scheme of things to the extent that this is considered advantageous, but it will not hesitate in going down the unilateral path if it sees some benefit in that.
Excellent. I've got a few, oh gosh, okay. I'll take one from the online audience, come to the room, and then I'll take another one later. So Alice Phillips from the Tony Blair Institute asks, would Ambassador Patriota agree with the emerging argument that Itamaraty is no longer the sole actor influencing Brazilian foreign policy, i.e. the role of other ministries and the private sector is growing? And where is the mic? Yes, please. Patrick.
Hi, I'm Patrick Winter from The Guardian. I was at a security conference about a fortnight ago, and there was a Western diplomat there who said that he held no fears or concern about the BRICS because, in fact, it had no ideological coherence whatsoever, and the more it expands, the less ideological coherence it does have. I was just wondering whether you agreed with that and whether you felt in particular that the way in which you turn a blind eye to what happens in Ukraine weakens your kind of foreign policy position.
Whether, I'm not sure.
Blind eye that you turn towards what happens, using your phrase about towards what happens in Ukraine in terms of your relations with Russia.
You are describing our position as a blind eye?
I'm asking you whether you feel that is that you turn a blind eye to what happens in Ukraine in the same way as you accuse others of turning a blind eye to what America has done.
And Lucy, over there.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. I'm Prati Agarwal. I work at ODI. I spent a lot of time in Brazil at Itamaraty because my PhD dissertation was on Mercosur. And so about that, you mentioned that there's going to be a multipolar world and we're looking towards that. And Brazil has been quite protectionist when it comes to trade since the early 21st century. Do you see in this multipolar world, do you see Mercosur being one of the poles, or do you think Brazil is going to go at it alone? Yet again, sorry for the last bit.
Okay, and colleague over there.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. My name's Clive Baldwin from Human Rights Watch. I was wondering how you would see Brazil's role in the growing discussion and even demand for reparations for colonial and related atrocities like the transatlantic slave trade, which we're hearing increasingly so from the African Union, CARICOM, and other countries. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So about Itamaraty no longer the only player. I think we have to start by recognizing the uniqueness of Itamaraty in the Americas. Brazil is practically the only country that has had, let's say, an institutionalized diplomacy for most of the post-World War II period. So with an entrance examination and practically all ambassadors being career ambassadors, almost every country in the Americas, starting with the United States, but Canada, Argentina, Colombia, et cetera, have a percentage of political appointees. So they don't have the same institutional memory Itamaraty has. They don't play the same role in the foreign policy environment within those countries as our own foreign ministry does. I'll give you another piece of information which is not very well known. In order to be promoted to ambassador rank in Brazil, you have to present a thesis, which is comparable to a doctoral thesis. And you present this in front of a group of, how do you call this in English? A board of peers, diplomats, but also of specialists from academia. Now, this has been in force since the 1980s. What that creates is a whole library of studies about every possible imaginable foreign policy issue. So from individual countries, let's say you're interested in Bolivia, there will probably be 4 or 5 theses on Bolivia. You're interested in law of the sea, there will be another. So to my knowledge, we are the only foreign ministry with this profile. So my first point is to say, for those who would write off the influence of Itamaraty, I think they're on the wrong track. It remains very powerful, and it has a role in Brazil that no other foreign ministry in the Americas has, or few countries in the world have a foreign ministry with such expertise. On the other hand, it's true that foreign policy has become an area of interest for wider society in ways that was not the case in recent Brazilian history. So you can look at the proliferation of courses of international relations around the country. I mean, every major city in Brazil, probably in São Paulo state, you would have like 10 cities with international relations courses. So all the graduates from these courses they don't all go into diplomacy. They go into private sector, they go into journalism, they go into marketing, tourism, etc. And that generates, let's say, a new area of expertise that is to some degree a novelty. Then you have very important companies like JBS, for example, right? The #1 meat packing company in the world that sells to, I don't know, hundreds of markets. They have their own capacity for, let's say, economic analysis, trade analysis, political analysis, which was not necessarily the case either even as recently as when I entered the diplomatic corps. So my answer is Itamaraty remains significant, but there are other actors, other players, civil society. When I was foreign minister, I actually promoted the idea, which was not implemented, unfortunately, but I hope that one day it will, of a kind of ombudsman or a special unit within the ministry for networking with civil society and these other players that are interested in international affairs, because I think it's very important for the ministry to convey to the society that they are not, let's say, a self-sufficient and isolated group. And in some quarters in Brazil, there is a little bit of a tendency to view Brazilian diplomats in that light. So that's one. On the BRICS and ideological coherence, it's true that the BRICS bring together very disparate countries in terms of their political domestic lineup. You have democracies like Brazil, India, South Africa. You have one-party systems. You have sheikdoms from the Middle East, like United Arab Emirates. So there is no attempt among the BRICS to align when it comes to political system, human rights, even peace and security issues. The BRICS were born due to an Anglo-American economist, as you're very well aware, who saw them as an economically significant group of countries. They have remained economically significant. And I believe that the privileged area of coordination is one that deals with finance, investment, trade. This year, Brazil will be presiding over the BRICS, so we've also introduced health as a topic. We've also introduced global governance because on this front also there is a commonality. For example, in arguing in favor of a wider range of candidates to head the World Bank or the IMF, review quota systems in the Bretton Woods institutions. But you may also be aware that when it comes, for example, to Security Council reform, there is no common view within BRICS because the Chinese very much against enlargement in the permanent member category. And at our last foreign ministers BRICS meeting in Rio, it was not possible to reach a consensus on the notion that you needed new permanent members from Africa and the global south, because among the Africans, there are now 3 countries, Ethiopia, Egypt, and South Africa, and they have not sorted out among themselves. So, you know, the scope for coordination is wide, but it's limited at the same time. Now, whereas turning a blind eye to what happened in Ukraine, I think it's important here again, there's a Brazilian specificity within BRICS. I often make the point that Brazil doesn't adhere to international law in a selective way. We apply the same yardstick throughout. So Brazil was the only country among the BRICS to actually have condemned the Russian invasion in the General Assembly in several different votes, and even supported Security Council condemnation as well. And there's no doubt that we view the unilateral invasion of country and disrespect for territorial integrity as a major violation of international law. Curiously, you will be aware of this, that the other democracies within BRICS did not go along with Brazil on this matter. So you could argue that there is a certain double standard within countries of the South when it comes to questioning respect for international law. But in the case of Brazil, I think you will also identify a very consistent degree of positioning ourselves in this respect. We condemned the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We condemned the illegal occupation of Palestinian territory. We condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think we're in a more, let's say, consistent position when it comes to respect for international law than many others.
There's one question on reparations, and since we need to close, I may join with one. I've been very unfair to the online audience, so let me just take one other to the online audience. Maybe you can address them together. So Jose Sieber from UNHCR asks, in light of the global decline in financial and political support for humanitarian responses, traditionally led by actors from the global north, what role can Brazil, as a prominent global south actor and regional leader, play in sustaining and innovating humanitarian approaches, particularly in view of its experience with Operação Acolhida and the structured reception and protection of Venezuelan refugees?
You know, I'm tempted to take a shortcut to this question and say that a very prominent Brazilian was a very respected humanitarian in this respect, Sérgio Vieira de Mello. He was in charge of the Office of Humanitarian Affairs at the United Nations Secretariat. He was High Commissioner for Human Rights. And in those capacities, I think he brought along a very Brazilian approach to humanitarian assistance. Once having a conversation with Samantha Power, former US ambassador to the UN, about her book on Sérgio Vieira de Mello, she was trying to argue, in fact, she did this in Brazil at the Diplomatic Academy, that what Sérgio brought was quite innovative in many ways because he didn't demonize any different faction. His major concern was in alleviating the suffering and bringing aid or solace or encouraging dialogue and some degree of accommodation among parties that otherwise would not speak to each other. And my response to Samantha Power was, Sérgio was very Brazilian in this respect. He was in Brazil. This doesn't really surprise anybody. You know, it may surprise to a US audience, but it's the normal way that we approach humanitarianism. So That may not be an entirely satisfactory answer because it's kind of a more of an attitude than a specific policy. But I think attitude matters in this respect.
But there's clearly an issue, because there was another question I didn't read. I was also asking about Brazil's role in helping reshape the global aid architecture and lessons they may have for African and Latin American partners, particularly because of your focus on South-South cooperation. It's clearly an interest in what Brazil may do.
Well, we have here the representative of the Red Cross. I think I'm not sure how much the global aid architecture needs to be reshaped. I think what you need is respect for international humanitarian law. And when you don't have respect, even at a very minimal level, no matter how much you devise a new architecture, your hands will be tied. So this is where I think international pressure, political pressure, diplomatic pressure, in which we invest quite a bit, is one pathway, one important pathway. By the way, I didn't answer the question about the reparations. And you know, come to think of it, I don't have a very good answer to that question. Yeah, I think it's my honest response. I can see the arguments in favor. I can see also the maybe, I wonder whether investing too much in this line of argument is going to bring the desired results. So I'm not sure how wise or efficient it is, but where I do support this is in generating an awareness of the abuse, of the violation of basic human rights that took place for decades, centuries, and that needs to be atoned for or brought into the picture. So I'm actually encouraged when I visit a museum like the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, where they recognize that the art collection was put together through wealth accumulated through slave trade, and that there are ways in which, you know, the museum has to recognize that, for example, by bringing in African curators to reimagine the museum in different ways.
Ambassador Patriota, we are at time. Thank you so much for sharing this hour with us. It's been such a fascinating insight into, you know, what Brazil has become as a leading globalist power. In this multipolar world, I think we could all do a lot more with the humanist foreign policy that you've been discussing today. And yeah, I think we all look up to Brazil to help few other countries follow in its footsteps.
Yes, but maybe as a concluding thought, where I think Brazil's humanist profile will be more effective is if we have more support from civil society, from think tanks, from academics, from women's groups and others, youth groups around the world, because we are functioning in a very unfavorable environment right now. I mean, it's not easy to be a humanist in the 21st century in 2025.
We've definitely enjoyed working very closely on the G20, on the Alliance on Hunger and Poverty, which I think is an enlightened initiative of Brazil, and now on the COP. So I really hope that more civil society actors and think tanks will you know, join hands. But please join us next door, for those of you who are here in the room, for some refreshments. And join me to thank very much Ambassador Antonio Patriota for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.